It began with a chuckle, low, sharp, and dripping with condescension. "Look at this guy," Officer McCoy muttered to his partner, giving him a nudge as a tall black man entered the courtroom, his charcoal gray suit fitting him with quiet elegance. "Probably some smooth-talking public defender," McCoy sneered. "Thinks he can play the system." The man didn't respond. He didn't even spare them a glance. His posture was erect, his stride steady, every movement measured with a dignity that needed no announcement. With a slight nod toward the bench, he took his seat in the gallery, third row from the front to officers McCoy and Riley. He was invisible in the way they were trained to see. Just another black man entering a courtroom. They never looked past his skin. That was their first mistake. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters lingered, murmuring among themselves about the day's case. Dorian Carter, a young black college student, stood accused of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. Body camera footage had, rather conveniently, gone missing. Witness testimonies clashed like swords, blurred and unreliable, and the officers, McCoy and Riley, held firmly to their narrative. They painted Dorian as aggressive, dangerous, and hostile, familiar words sewn deep into the lexicon of those who needed justification. Inside, the courtroom wasn't packed, but the tension was a living thing. As the prosecution began to weave its story, McCoy and Riley leaned back smugly behind their lawyer, occasionally whispering jibes under their breath. "What's he even doing here?" Riley chuckled, nodding toward the suited man. "Probably some uncle trying to look important." They didn't notice how the judge's eyes subtly softened at the man's presence. They missed the respectful nods of court officers as he passed. They didn't see the assistant district attorney briefly falter when her eyes met his. The man said nothing. He simply watched. Meanwhile, Dorian Carter sat next to his public defender, looking almost translucent with exhaustion. His hands twisted nervously in his lap. His mother, seated directly behind him, clutched a worn leather Bible so tightly it bent at the corners. She murmured silent prayers, her fingers trembling. The defense told Dorian's side. He had been walking home from a study session, earbuds in, hoodie up to brace against the late chill. He hadn't heard the officers shouting. When he finally noticed them storming toward him, hands twitching too close to their belts, panic had seized him. He'd raised his hands. He'd pleaded that he was unarmed. But they'd tackled him anyway. On the stand, Officer Riley spun a story lacquered with false heroism. "We feared for our safety," he intoned solemnly, while conveniently omitting that neither he nor McCoy bore any injury, save perhaps for the strain of holding their own biases. There were no bruises, no corroborating medical reports, only paperwork and an all-too-familiar narrative that America had heard echoing through its courtrooms too many times before. The defense rested. The judge called for a brief recess before closing arguments. It was then, as the room settled into an uneasy buzz, that the suited man rose from his seat. He walked calmly, deliberately, up the aisle, past the whispering attorneys, past the stunned defendant, until he stood directly before the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but carrying a gravity that made even the floorboards seem to still themselves. The judge straightened, recognizing the quiet authority before her. "Of course, Director Lawson," she said, offering the faintest smile. "You have the floor." A collective ripple passed through the courtroom. "Director Lawson." Officer McCoy's face blanched. Riley stiffened beside him. The man turned to the room, surveying them with eyes that were neither angry nor triumphant, but deeply, profoundly weary. "My name is Cameron Lawson," he said. "I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A wave of gasps broke from the gallery. One woman clutched her handbag to her chest. Dorian's mother dropped her Bible. Lawson continued, his tone even, but firm enough to carve into stone. "I am here today not as the head of a federal agency, but as a black man who knows too well how thin the margin of safety is for people who look like Dorian Carter. I read the case file. I saw the missing footage, the contradictions, the silences, and I recognized a story that mirrors too many others." He turned deliberately to McCoy and Riley. who were now rigid in their seats. I have been stopped for jogging through my own neighborhood. I have been followed while shopping. I have stared down barrels pointed at me without cause. The only difference between Dorian Carter and myself is this suit and this title. Silence flooded the room. And I want every person here to understand something, Lawson said, his voice sinking into the marrow of the room. If I had worn a hoodie today instead of this suit, you would have dismissed me too. And that, he said, pausing to let the weight settle, is exactly what you did to Dorian. Turning back to the judge, his voice softened. Your Honor, I do not seek to interfere with your ruling, but I ask this court to recognize that this is not about a single incident. It is about a system that confuses presence with guilt and skin tone with threat. Then he faced Dorian, his gaze full of something powerful, something ancestral, something that said, I see you. You are not invisible, Lawson said. You matter, and you are not alone. The room was frozen. No more whispers. No laughter. Even the ventilation hum seemed to hush itself. The jury was sent to deliberate. It took less than 2 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood, her hands trembling slightly. Not guilty, she said, her voice breaking down. A murmur of released tension surged through the gallery. Outside, reporters stormed the courthouse steps. The headlines blazed before the ink could dry. FBI director shocks courtroom with emotional speech defending black teen. Clips of Lawson's speech spread like wildfire across the nation, reaching phones, televisions, radios within minutes. But the man himself did not linger. He found Dorian and his mother standing on the courthouse steps, both looking shell-shocked, a raw mixture of gratitude and disbelief written across their faces. Thank you, sir, Dorian whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. You didn't have to. Lawson placed a hand on his shoulder. Yes, I did, he said quietly. And one day you will too. That night, Officer McCoy walked into the precinct, dropped his badge onto the duty sergeant's desk, and left without a word. Officer Riley was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full departmental review. The mayor's office released a statement within hours, acknowledging grave concerns regarding systemic failures within local law enforcement. Director Lawson returned to Washington the next morning. Alone in his office overlooking the monuments of American ideals, he sat at his desk and reflected on the many times he had swallowed his anger for the sake of survival, on the countless rooms where he had been underestimated, on the silent wars he had fought just to exist with dignity, and on how, for once, he had refused to stay silent. He thought of a truth that too often went unspoken. Respect should never be measured by appearance. Justice should never be a privilege, and a man's worth must never be defined by the color of his skin. Not everyone in that courtroom walked away changed, but some did, and sometimes that is enough to begin to in a world where judgment too often comes before understanding. One man's presence had shaken a system that needed it, and somewhere, deep within the silence that followed, a small but resolute hope was born.